So good morning and thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So I began this research with Susan Hellman in 2009. Susan Hellman is, some of you may know her, she is the principal historic preservation planner for the city of Alexandria. She and I are longtime friends and longtime research and writing partners. The National Trust for Historic Preservation awarded us with a 2-year research grant to provide consulting services in support of an expanded historical interpretation of Woodlawn Plantation. The grant was funded in substantial part by the Interpretation and Education Fund of the National Trust in cooperation with the National Endowment for Humanities and the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund. Our work was featured in the May-June 2010 issue of Preservation magazine. After we completed the grant project in 2011, we independently continued our research with an expanded scope. In February of 2017, our work was published in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, and we continue to delve into this fascinating topic even today. We continue to research this today. This story begins in 1674, when Nicholas Spencer and John Washington, that's George Washington's great-grandfather, received a patent for approximately 5,000 acres of land along the Potomac River in what would later become Fairfax County, Virginia. On this land in 1735, George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, constructed the dwelling that was later to be called Mount Vernon. George Washington inherited a managing interest in the estate from his half-brother Lawrence in 1752 and came into full ownership upon his sister-in-law's death in 1761. And between 1752 and 1799, the year of Washington's death, he expanded Mount Vernon to approximately 7,600 acres. George Washington's death in December of 1799 sparked a revolutionary chain of events that transformed a small corner of Fairfax County, Virginia. I propose to outline the unique antebellum cultural and racial relocation patterns that resulted from Washington's remarkable decision to emancipate his slaves. The subsequent chain of events led to the creation of a completely unique community. And just to ground everyone, in the slides, you will see this map, historic map of Fairfax County, Virginia. The red flag denotes the location of the Mount Vernon mansion. And the area that I will be referring to this morning as the Mount Vernon Woodlawn neighborhood is circled in each slide in red. And here are the Mount Vernon lands in 1793 as surveyed by Washington himself. The flag on the right again is the mansion house, and the flag on the left is the land on which the Woodlawn mansion was built in 1805. And here's a current view of the same land. And the area that we are discussing today includes this entire area and really just a tad beyond. In addition to land, Washington purchased slaves. Washington became a slaveholder at age 11 when he inherited enslaved people from his father. Washington purchased additional slaves throughout his lifetime. By the time Washington died in 1799, there were 276 enslaved individuals living and working on the Mount Vernon estate. Of those 276 slaves, 123 were the property of George Washington. The other 153 individuals were solely owned or held by Martha Washington. These 153 individuals were bequeathed to her from her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. Historically, these 153 enslaved individuals have been known as, and I will continue to refer to them today as the Dower slaves, Martha Washington's Dower slaves. This distinction in status of the enslaved individuals at Mount Vernon was critical. Although by law he could manage Martha Washington's dower slaves, Washington could not make any decisions regarding their sale or potential manumission. In his 1799 will, Washington emancipated all of his slaves upon the death of Martha Washington. He did not have the legal right to free Martha's dower slaves in his will. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799, and Martha Washington did not wait, and she went ahead and emancipated those 123 individuals effective January 1, 1801. And upon Martha Washington's death in 1802, all 153 of her dower slaves were divided and partitioned out locally amongst the surviving Custis heirs. They were not emancipated. To look at this from a slightly different angle, we are talking about 276 enslaved people on the Mount Vernon estate who had lived together, worked together, married each other, had children together, raised their families, and had been interconnected with each other in every single way for over 40 years. Half of those individuals were emancipated, half were not, and continued to exist in slavery for another 60 years. This slide shows a photo of the original inventory and division of Martha Washington's dower slaves. The overarching concern with any division of slaves is, of course, equal financial shares for each heir. So the dower slaves were inventoried by first name, by age, and by their monetary value. These people were then divided into 4 groups of equal value and parceled out to the 4 living Custis heirs. Small children were usually kept with their mothers, but that was usually the only provision made at such a division. And small children would really be a child still nursing. So anywhere, I think after you're about 3 or 4 years old, you are no longer considered to be with your mother. The division shows us that the dower slaves were divided among Martha Washington's 4 surviving grandchildren. Some of these individuals went to Martha Park Custis Peter at Tudor Place in Georgetown, Elizabeth Park Custis Law at Hoxton House. Hoxton House would become the Episcopal High School a few decades later, Eleanor Park Custis Lewis at Woodlawn Plantation, and George Washington Park Custis at Arlington House. So just to recap, between 1799 and 1802, both George and Martha Washington die. Washington's slaves are emancipated. Martha's dower slaves are not emancipated. Martha's dower slaves are divided amongst the 4 heirs here and sent to those estates and farms. Mount Vernon is inherited by George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, who arrives into the neighborhood with his own enslaved holdings. George Washington's will called for some of his, quote, aged slaves, end quote, to be taken care of by Bushrod Washington. And there are household account records that actually support this. It seems that about 10 of the older slaves received rations until they died. They appear to have been residing somewhere on the Mount Vernon estate. But for the remainder of those 123 enslaved individuals that had been held by George Washington and emancipated by him, what happened to all of them next is still not fully clear. Many of the enslaved individuals emancipated by George Washington remained in the general vicinity of Mount Vernon, as many had family members who remained enslaved in the surrounding area on other farms and plantations. That would include the dower slaves who were bequeathed to Lawrence and Eleanor Lewis at the Woodlawn Plantation. Some may have followed their enslaved families that were part of the dower slave division and resided in those areas as part of emerging free Black populations. Many settled in Alexandria. What we did establish with our research is that in the first part of the 19th century, other slaveholders in the greater Mount Vernon Woodlawn community followed Washington's example and freed their slaves as well. Between 1799 and 1806, 30 deeds of manumission were recorded at the Fairfax County Courthouse, freeing at least 46 enslaved individuals. A large percentage of those emancipated lived on farms and plantations near Mount Vernon. Many of these said emancipated individuals likely joined the former Washington slaves in establishing a free Black enclave somewhere in the Mount Vernon Woodlawn neighborhood. In the 1812 personal property tax list for this area of Fairfax County, it gives us a really intriguing possibility. That year included a separate listing for all of the, quote, free Blacks in Freetown, end quote. The listing for Freetown is the earliest known recorded reference to a free Black settlement in Fairfax County. All of the individuals listed as residing in Freetown in 1812 are also listed together on the 1811 personal property tax list. But in 1811, they are identified there as, quote, General Washington's free Negroes, end quote. Unfortunately, the exact location of Freetown is unknown. However, the fact that the Freetown inhabitants are referred to as George Washington's free Negroes in 1811 implies that Freetown was on or near the Mount Vernon estate. And currently, we think that this area was much closer to the Woodlawn plantation. And we were actually out there last week looking for any interesting signs and reading landscape in that area, in a certain area. So again, to this day, we are continuing to look into this because it is remarkable and fascinating and just so important. One thing is clear: Freetown was established decades before the free Black community of Gum Springs. The Fairfax County slaveholders who followed Washington's example and emancipated their slaves were not necessarily being altruistic. At the founding of Fairfax County in 1742, 29% of its population was enslaved. By 1810, that percentage had increased to 45%. The slave-based society was not sustainable. The primary crop, tobacco, had exhausted the soil. As the 18th century progressed, land fertility and value plummeted, plunging many landowners into significant economic distress. Many slaveholders freed their slaves because they could no longer afford to keep them. In 1806, because of the increased population of free Blacks, the Virginia General Assembly enacted legislation that required all free people of color to leave Virginia within a year of their emancipation. Those who did not leave forfeited their right to freedom by being sold at auction back into slavery. However, those freed prior to the law's enactment were permitted to remain, which included those manumitted by Washington. In 1810, 543 free people of color resided in Fairfax County. Of this number, approximately 25% of those individuals lived in the Mount Vernon Woodlawn neighborhood. Property taxes and census records indicate that some of these free Blacks were also slaveholders. Now, while this may appear shocking, the reason behind this action needs to be explained. It was done for protection. It appears that many free Blacks purchased newly manumitted family members to prevent them from having to leave the state. And for example, in the 1850 Fairfax County slave schedule that's on your screen now, it indicates that John Holland, who was the son of an emancipated Washington slave, was also the slaveholder of a 4-year-old Black male. This may well have been his son or another family member he hoped to protect from being carried out of the state. This was, okay, so let's just, there's always a lot of controversy around this, and I want to make it very clear that this was done for protecting family members. Within a generation of George Washington's death in 1799 to the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the population composition of the Mount Vernon Woodlawn neighborhood changed dramatically. Through the first half of the 19th century, declining economic conditions in Fairfax County prompted struggling landowners to sell their land and move elsewhere in hopes of a fresh start. George Washington's heirs followed this antebellum land selling trend as well. And in the decades after Washington's death, they sold off parcels of his Mount Vernon estate. In 1858, they sold the last remaining lot, which is the mansion house parcel itself, to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. During the early mid to 19th century, this area witnessed another turnover in population, moving from an area dominated by wealthy slaveholding planters to an area composed of primarily small family farms and soil tilled by free men. In addition to the traffic of families departing Fairfax County, the antebellum period witnessed a steady influx of families into the county. Men from Maine, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other northern states snapped up large parcels of land at rock bottom prices. They streamed into Fairfax County ready to apply progressive farming practices and, in some cases, a new social agenda. These northern anti-slavery families bought up a large portion of the Mount Vernon estate. They also purchased and settled on other local plantations that had once belonged to some of the most elite first families of Virginia. By the time of the Civil War, approximately 40 northern families had settled on and around the Mount Vernon estate. This population turnover cannot be completely attributed to cheap land prices. Members of the Society of Friends, commonly known as Quakers, were also drawn to the by then established free Black community surrounding Mount Vernon. Most of Mount Vernon's plantation lands were initially purchased by Friends who hoped to prove to Southerners that successful farming did not require slave labor. In 1846, the Troth, Gillingham and Company Lumber Partnership, Quakers, who supplied timber to shipyards, purchased Woodlawn, the plantation that Washington had carved out of the Mount Vernon lands and given to his nephew and stepdaughter, Lawrence and Eleanor Lewis. In order to create their free labor colony, the Troths and Gillinghams subdivided this almost 2,000-acre woodlawn tract into small family farms ranging in size from 25 to 270 acres. In addition to members of the Society of Friends, the Troths and Gillinghams sold land to like-minded Baptists and to the local free Black community, increasing the diversity all across. Chalkley Gillingham, a friend who purchased an interest in the Woodlawn plantation, wrote in his journal, quote, "We find no difficulty in getting along without the use of slave labor. This was one object in coming here, to establish a free labor colony in a slave state," end quote. The free labor community, built on the foundation of Washington's emancipation legacy, consisted of 4 unique social factions: white newcomers from the North, white Southerners, both slaveholding and non-slaveholding, free people of color, and enslaved individuals. In the years leading up, up to the outbreak of the Civil War, it was remarkably harmonious. It was a remarkably harmonious enclave. Jacob Troth, one of the Friends, later wrote about the area, quote, "It passed into the hands of Quakers and anti-slavery men and became free soil. It at once became the center of a society dominated by religious sentiments and temperance propaganda, a pure democracy," end quote. Troth wrote that these Northerners reclaimed the area, quote, "not only from the forest, but from the dry rot of slavery," end quote. The Northerners founded schools and churches. They also created jobs. There were forests to clear, crops to sow and harvest, roads to build, animals to tend, and a whole host of other jobs to be filled. In the 1864 diary of Ebenezer Mason, who was a justice of the Fairfax County Court, a founder of the Woodlawn Baptist Church, and part owner of the Woodlawn Plantation, included several references to free Blacks and whites working together on his farm, as well as regular business dealings with free Blacks in the community. The Troth Gillingham and Company's Accotink Grist and Sawmill served the entire community regardless of race. Chockley Gillingham's diary mentions many business transactions involving the free Blacks in the neighborhood. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. On May 23rd, Fairfax County citizens voted on the Ordinance of Secession, which asked voters to decide whether or not Virginia should secede from the Union. Most of the white residents of the Mount Vernon Woodlawn area voted at the Accotink precinct. It was a small village approximately 4 miles west of Mount Vernon. It is Fort Belvoir today. Of the 14 voting precincts in Fairfax County, only 3 voted against the ordinance: Lewinsville, Lydecker, and Accotink. Accotink voted 19 for secession, 76 opposed. Voting against secession took courage. The vote was not secret. Voters signed their name on a sheet of paper in either the for ratification column or the for rejection column. And this is the actual Accotink voting list. The day after the secession vote, Union troops occupied Alexandria, 8 miles north of Mount Vernon. Our free labor colony was stranded just outside the Union lines for several months until the Union Army finally extended its reach as far as Woodlawn. Chockley Gillingham wrote that, quote, "We were alarmed continually by scouting parties of rebel troops coming into the neighborhood and carrying off men, horses, wagons, and provisions," end quote. The Union Provost Marshal's office in Washington referred to this area as, quote, "one of the most vulnerable positions of our entire lines," end quote. It was the crucial area for both sides, right at the dividing line between North and South. Scouting and foraging parties came and went almost constantly. Both sides were guilty of confiscating items and taking captives from the local populace. The Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania in June of 1863 drew the Union troops away from the area, leaving it even more vulnerable to the Confederates. Rebel raids increased dramatically. Woodlawn plantation owner Ebenezer Mason took action. After 2 years of imploring, he finally convinced General Henry Horatio Wells, the Union Provost Marshal in Alexandria, to allow the formation of a home guard based out of Accotink for the protection of the local citizenry. Typically officially sanctioned home guard units served wherever Union commanders sent them. The Accotink Home Guard was unique. Its members remained at home, protecting their own community. In Ebenezer Mason's own words, quote, "I don't suppose it was altogether strictly legal, but it had Wells' approval, and I organized all the local element I could. It was as much for self-protection as anything else. But we still rendered the government a great deal of service. From the time we organized, the government never lost a horse or a cent's worth of property from Alexandria down the river 16 miles, end quote. Ebenezer Mason recruited willing members from all segments of the local Mount Vernon Woodlawn population, creating a racially integrated military unit. Even the pacifist Quakers joined. In addition to approving Mason's Accotink Home Guard, General Wells provided Union weapons for their use. An Alexandria Gazette headline indicates that all of the Accotink Home Guard members were armed, not just the whites. The free Blacks and Northern settlers surrounding Mount Vernon had worked and lived harmoniously together for years prior to the war. They had forged relationships that war could not break, and they continued to rely upon one another. At this time, we have not yet found any evidence of another officially sanctioned integrated home guard. After the war, one neighborhood friend said, during the war, quote, "During the war, no more loyal community could be found in the South. We took our lives into our hands and stood for our country. which has never in any way recognized our devotion to its cause, end quote. I'd like to now tell you a little bit more about some of the Mount Vernon Woodlawn community, free Black population and community members. This is William, or Billy Holland. He was born free in about 1816 in Mount Vernon Woodlawn neighborhood. He was the son of Matilda Holland, who was one of the slaves emancipated by the will of George Washington. In 1856, he himself became a landowner, purchasing 20 acres of the former Woodlawn estate. He was also a member of the Accotink Home Guard. We have John Holland, who was born free in about 1825. He was also the son of Matilda Holland, who was emancipated by the will of Washington. He's the brother of Billy Holland, member of the Accotink Home Guard. And as we talked about a few slides back, on the 1850 slave schedule for Fairfax County, John Holland is shown as a slaveholder of an unnamed 4-year-old Black male child. John Ignatius Green registered as a free person of color at the Fairfax County Courthouse in August of 1841. He was born about 1821. He was the son of a woman named Agreeable, who was emancipated in the year 1809 by Benjamin Burton. Burton, a white slaveholder, had lived in the Mount Vernon neighborhood. He was also a member of the Accotink Home Guard. Let's talk a little bit about the registration of free Negroes. In 1793, the Virginia General Assembly enacted legislation, quote, to restrain the practice of Negroes going at large, end quote. The statute required that, quote, every free Negro or mulatto, end quote, was required to register with the clerk of court in the city or county where he or she resided. Registration was required yearly in the cities and every 3 years in the counties. The registration was required to specify the registrant was required to specify his or her age, name, color, stature, by whom and in what court the said Negro or mulatto was emancipated, or that such Negro or mulatto was born free, end quote. In Fairfax County, the registration book with entries from 1793 to 1821 is missing. The Fairfax County registrations start in 1822 and go through April 15th of 1861. The Alexandria registrations are mostly intact and cover the full 1793 to 1821 time period. And not every free person of color registered, and certainly not every 3 years. So it is not a complete listing of every free person of color. The registrations give us family genealogical info as one's freedom status comes through one's mother. If your mother was enslaved, you are enslaved. If your mother was a free woman of color, you are born free. These registrations will usually identify the first and last names of family members. And any white person could challenge a free person of color at any time to prove your freedom status by showing your papers. Essentially, a free person of color arrived at the courthouse and paid a tax on this document. A copy was given to said registrant and the clerk made a copy in the ledger book for their records. It is these books that we utilize today. Only a few original paper registrations that were given to a free person of color are known to still exist. There is one that is part of a collection at the Loudoun County Archives. It is folded into a small square and was carried around for safekeeping in the individual's shoe. This photo, taken in the early 1900s, is of James Dent and his wife, Jane. Mr. Dent was the grandson of a slave manumitted by George Washington and a founding trustee of the Woodlawn Colored Meeting and School Association, which in 1866 was officially the first African-American church and school to be recorded purchasing their own land at the Fairfax County Courthouse. George Washington's will provided long-range and far-reaching benefits for the entire community. By following Washington's lead, the Northern families who invested in Washington's land had also invested in his former slaves and their descendants. This created an environment that enabled the Mount Vernon Woodlawn free Black population to embrace the opportunity to become educated, engaged, and invested in their community on levels of equality that were not seen anywhere else in our region. Thank you. I'm going to.
When the Quakers tried their experiment of using only free people as laborers, what was the reaction of the folks who surrounded them that were still using enslaved people as their laborers?
There are indications that there was hostility in the neighborhood, but the Quakers seemed to go out of their way to forge decent relationships across the board. They shared a lot of their technology. They shared a lot of their information with some of their white slaveholding neighbors to try and sort of bring them over to their side, so to speak, which we have indication that it worked to some degree, but it did absolutely become a bubble, a geographically divided bubble.
How did the free Black, the former slaves, how did they support them? What did they do for their livelihoods?
It's a really good question. It is likely because there's this time period of post-emancipation to about the 1820s and 30s that we really have no concrete idea where these individuals are truly living, worshiping, and surviving. They are clearly farming. Often, so it's interesting, Washington allowed his enslaved individuals to go into Alexandria on Sundays to sell produce. It's entirely possible that some of these families continued that type of movement in business opportunities. It is not clear. Well, and then I should point out that many of these people were also skilled. There could have been several blacksmiths. So again, you have a skilled population, you have a population that's farming. They're pretty much self-sufficient with probably foraging into Alexandria.
Okay, and sorry, a related question. Did the farming improve? You said the Northerners brought better agricultural techniques.
They brought techniques, right. So they started using, they were big enthusiasts of guano. So the guano fertilizer, they were huge into this, but they were using, they brought in these techniques that were really just not being utilized here at all. As our soil was continued to be depleted and depleted, they came in and really gave it this injection. And people saw the benefits and started moving with them as well and utilizing their methods.
Thanks.
Maddy?
Yeah.
Andrea, two questions. First off, I just want to clarify that could you repeat about, did free Blacks pay tax when they registered every year? They were supposed to pay tax on their freedom papers?
Yes. So like anything else, I mean, it's anytime you go to the courthouse and register something with the clerk, you are paid for that. I identify it as a tax. It is, because it is a tax. It is, but let me go on about that very quickly. As the law stated, you needed to file yearly in the city, but every 3 years in a county. I can promise you, I have read every registration of free Negro for this entire state. No one did that. It did not, there is not one person in the entire state that actually followed the law. So it was very interesting. Go ahead. Sorry. And your next question, Andrea?
The next question was, I wondered if you could comment and put Gum Springs into perspective as it relates to this Freetown for Mount Vernon.
So Freetown, again, Freetown, it's this huge question mark for us. Where was Freetown? As the records show later, it really is clear that some of these individuals are closer over to that woodlawn plantation side of things, over towards Accotink. So did they immediately settle there? It is unclear, but Gum Springs really only comes into existence, really it's the 1840s, I think. And that is West Ford, everybody is, most people, he's a very, very famous historical individual in our area. He was a free person. He was emancipated by Bushrod, so Washington's nephew. So this is actually long after George Washington dies. You've got this whole other Washington family here on the ground and out at Mount Vernon, again, bringing in their own enslaved individuals. West Ford is part of that population. He is emancipated, and he is given land and purchases a lot more in Gum Springs. And that's about 40 years later. And Gum Springs is over on Fordson Road and Route 1. So it's really on the other side of the Mount Vernon tract, but it is much, much later. And of course, still a community that identifies with a church, a cemetery today in that neighborhood.
Thank you.
Maddy, we have a question that came through the chat.
Okay.
Are there ways around the requirement that freed persons who had been enslaved leave the state other than being enslaved by a free person of color?
It's really interesting. It is hard to identify how people manipulated the system. And I say manipulated with that as an empowered term. People were leaving and coming back. People were skirting enumerators. But at the same time, it is not entirely clear to me that people weren't just sort of emancipated and living their lives and raising their children and grandchildren locally as well, because we see that in the records too. So some people were given a pass. I don't know why, but some people left and went to Ohio or Pennsylvania. There is a underdocumented but rich underground railroad tradition that stems from Alexandria and Fairfax County. Are people going and strategically situating themselves in other areas to help facilitate that? I think so. But there's no great one answer, and it seems to be all over and the board and at different times, just different things. But you will see people leave and you will never hear of them again. And then you will see them in the 1870 census with their families in Ohio or Pennsylvania later.
I have a question. About other Black communities. I live in the Bailey's Crossroads area.
Okay.
And it was told to us when we moved here that part of this area had been settled by free Blacks. Mm-hmm. And there is a family around the corner the Summers family, who live on Summers Lane. Mm-hmm. And that street had been in their family for a long time. I wondered if you knew anything about that.
Sure. Bailey's Crossroad, Warner Baptist Church. That is absolutely, it is an old African-American community. What I have found, what is interesting, a lot of these sort of very early, when I say early, so post-Civil War, a lot of these early Black communities are absolutely coming out of enslaved hubs. So larger slaveholders, places where there would have been larger communities of enslaved people. Clifton is a fantastic example. Clifton is essentially born out of a slave quarter. Bailey's Crossroad, so all of these early Black communities springboard off of these larger enslaved communities. Free Black communities as well, but Bailey's would be a great example of a larger enslaved community coming into its own after the war.
Thank you.
Sure.
My wife and I often walk on Quander Road, which now has on it West Potomac High School. And I just came to the knowledge about 2 years ago that the Quanders were an African-American family that I think they still live on the road, or there's a part of the family that still has a house there. Do you know anything about the Quanders? And do they go back to this period?
Quanders are, they're famous. They are so well known. It's fascinating. So there's one of their descendants is a historian, and his name is Rahman Quander. Why I'm saying this, he literally just published his latest Quander family book. It is you could probably just type in Quander Fairfax County book on a search engine. He's published many things. He is sort of the family historian. He is so well versed in it. But yes, the Quanders, what a fantastically unusual name to be able to follow people in slavery. It's not like Williams or Jones. If you are a Quander, we are so excited if you're a Quander. But the Quanders are enslaved at Mount Vernon. They are enslaved at different plantations and farms in that part of the county, for sure. So we find Quanders, enslaved Quanders, showing up in inventories that we didn't know. So there are a lot of Quanders. They're often tied back to Mount Vernon, but there are other pockets of Quanders. And Quander Road is Quander Central, yes.
I would like to just follow this up a little bit to show you that history is current as well. I went to high school at Groveton High School, which of course became West Potomac. And in my high school class, I was friends with Wilton Quander, and I was also friends with Corbin Bushrod Washington. So there's that arc of history for a brief moment seemed to be working very well. And I remember going to Bryant, which is now West Potomac, the same site as intermediate school. And the Quander farm was still over the fence there, and the old Quander mule would serenade us during flag football games. So that's all very current.
We need to do an oral history with you. That's great. That's really great.
Another question that came in is, was Fort Ward the site of a free Black community? Was that before the Civil War or was that later?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was part of the the Fort Ward Free Black. So much research over so many years. It is so, my thoughts on this are that it was, we're figuring out more all the time. I think it was not necessarily a large free Black community. I don't think so, because of the large, very strong slaveholding families in that area, i.e. the Lees, Cassius Lee, and it seems, and when we look at surnames and we look at individuals coming in that were identified during the war and just after, they absolutely seem to be coming in from other parts of the state. So I think that there is a large enslaved community there that, again, Fort Ward is picked because of its geographical location, as all the others are, but it is, I really don't think there was a large free Black community there before. I don't. I think it was mostly enslaved.
Maddy, are there still institutions, schools, churches, businesses that were established during that the antebellum period that you were talking about in the main body of your presentation that still exists today?
Clarify a little bit more by what you mean.
Well, was there like a Methodist church or a Baptist church that was established by the free Black community in the area that still exists, or maybe a business that in one form or another has stood the test of time?
Thank you. So to clarify, it was illegal for any free person of color to practice religion openly, to learn how to read or write, way up until, there are these incredibly draconian laws that were continually placed. So clearly people are worshiping, clearly people are gathering, as people do, but it was not legal for them to do as such. So when you see these communities sort of springboarding after the Civil War, you clearly know that they are worshiping prior to, somehow, some way. They just are going in and making it official by purchasing that land. So again, it's illegal. So we don't have a lot of documentation because it was not done in plain sight.
Question that came up, Maddy, would you please speak about the Equal Justice Initiative and how OPMH may become involved?
Sure, absolutely. So we in the city of Alexandria started our journey of the Equal Justice Initiative in almost about 2 years ago. I am in charge of the research. Essentially, what my purview was to document as best as possible the 2 lynchings that took place in our city. And that was of Joseph McCoy in 1897 and Benjamin Thomas in 1899. I have a phenomenal research group that is, we have put together these incredibly difficult narratives. They are available on the city's website, but we have a lot of different subcommittees as far as educational outreach. There's a lot of things that we would like to do. I will say that the pandemic has made this more difficult. Meeting virtually has made it a little bit more difficult. But the city is absolutely committed to honoring and marking both lynchings every year. And I think once things open up a little bit more, we will start considering doing our soil collections from the sites, which is a big part of the Equal Justice Initiative, bringing soil to their museum and retrieving our pillar, which would have the names of the 2 boys. And I say boys because that's a big, let's identify this these were teenagers. We will be going down. And so there are pilgrimage committees. So there's a lot of ways you can get involved. We have a ton of different subcommittees, but I will say the research is essentially done. We've done it. And now we're moving into the more of how do we bring this back into the city. If you do go onto the city's website for Office of Historic Alexandria, there are a lot of events that we've been planning, trying to do them virtually as well. Speakers, that type of things that will advance any sort of anti-racism education and acknowledging what happened here and how are we talking about that and dealing with that and moving on, and maybe not even moving on because maybe we shouldn't be moving on. Maybe we need to acknowledge these things. So there's a lot of talking and a lot of work being done. We are always looking for more people to join these conversations.
All right, we're running low on time. I think we have time for 2 more questions. The last one will be a doozy, but the first one is, who is buried in the cemetery on the Quander Road side of the West Potomac property?
I know cemeteries very well, and I'm horrified to say I don't know off the top of my head, but the Fairfax County Genealogical Society's website, you can go in and they have digitized their cemetery records. And they're probably quanders, I would think, many quanders, but I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I'm almost embarrassed to say. And then reparations, well, very quickly. So I am part of the Virginia Theological Seminaries Reparations Project. That's been going on for about 1.5 years now. We are identifying anybody who was enslaved by or on the campus. And then we're also looking at individuals who may have worked there up until the cutoff is 1853, because that is when African Americans were allowed to participate in the seminary education, albeit not on the site. So we are trying to identify individuals who will qualify for financial reparations. There are a couple of other universities that are doing this, but they are looking at it from other ways of it's purely monuments and education, like Georgetown University. VTS is committed to, VTS is a large fund, and we are looking at it as a financial reparation. And that's really the first of its kind. People are, and with that goes a huge learning curve as well. But hopefully more and more people will start doing this.
I would like to thank you so much for being with us today. I think all of us, I'm speaking for everybody, but I have learned so much from
Thank you.
listening to you and just learning the history of our area.